Usually when you sit down to play a game, like the very first thing you do is agree on the rules.
Right, you have to. It's the foundation of everything.
Exactly. I mean, if you move your pawn this way, I get to move mine that way. It's predictable. It's fair. But imagine stepping onto a field where the rule book is constantly being rewritten while the ball is, literally already in the air.
Yeah, that sounds like a nightmare.
It is. Depending entirely on who is holding the ball, the boundary lines just shift. You start to notice that, like, your silence is suddenly being treated as a confession of guilt, but then your attempts to speak up are immediately flagged as acts of aggression.
Which is a totally unwinnable situation.
Right. It's a game where your exhaustion is framed as a personal failing, but someone else's exhaustion is treated as this massive systemic crisis. So, have you ever felt that invisible shift in the atmosphere?
It's an incredibly disorienting experience.
Yeah.
I mean, it is akin to stepping up to a set of scales of justice that appear perfectly balanced, right? But then you realize the calibration weights are secretly being swapped under the table.
Oh, depending entirely on who approaches the bench.
Exactly. The architecture of the interaction has been altered, yet everyone is basically mandated to pretend the scales are operating normally.
And that feeling of disorientation, that shifting of the scales, that is the starting point for today's deep dive. We are doing an exhaustive cover-to-cover exploration of a highly provocative new ebook.
Yes, Cyberlad's Retreating from Gamma Bias and Double Binds.
Right, by Conrad Riker. And look, we need to be totally transparent about who this text is explicitly addressing right up front. Riker is writing for men who feel they are navigating a modern cultural and institutional landscape that has become, frankly, structurally hostile to them.
Yeah, he's very clear about his audience.
He really is. This is an architecture built for individuals who have experienced what's colloquially known as, like, a red pill awakening. Or, men's rights advocates, and really anyone trying to understand the history of our institutions before they were fundamentally captured.
Right, captured and altered by postmodernism, Marxist grievance economics, and modern feminism.
Exactly. And before we unpack a single page, we just need to set our ground rules for you listening. Our mission here is strictly analytical. We are going to unpack, analyze, and impartially report on the worldview, the arguments, and the historical timeline Riker presents.
Yeah, we're absolutely not taking political sides here.
No, not at all. We're not endorsing these viewpoints, nor are we condemning them. Our job is just to act as your expert guides, mapping the territory he laid out, strictly using his compass.
Because the utility of a text like this really lies in its forensic approach. I mean, Riker is not simply chronicling grievances. He's attempting to map the underlying operating system of modern social and legal institutions.
And we are going to look at the mechanics he describes, the actual gears turning inside this text. Now, if you want the full, unvarnished manual we're about to discuss, please check out Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books to buy Cyberlad's Retreating from Gamma Bias and Double Binds for yourself.
Highly recommend grabbing a copy to follow along.
Yeah, and follow the author directly at Conrad Riker on Substack. Also, take a second to like and subscribe to our show wherever you're listening, as it helps us keep doing these deep dives. So let's get into the mechanics. The entire architecture of Riker's book rests on this foundational diagnostic concept.
Right, which she calls gamma bias.
Exactly, gamma bias. So how does he define that?
So Riker defines gamma bias as a coordinated, systemic optical shift in society. It's basically a framework where identical actions produce opposite moral verdicts based entirely on the sex of the actor.
Okay, so a total double standard built into the system.
Yeah, but he presents a really specific matrix for this. Female positive behavior is amplified and celebrated, right? While female negative behavior is mitigated, contextualized, and excused by external factors.
Right, they always look for the root cause of why she did it.
Exactly. But conversely, male positive behavior is minimized. It's just seen as a basic, unrewarded duty. While male negative behavior is amplified into an indictment of masculinity as self.
He illustrates this with a pretty stark, everyday scenario that I think a lot of people will recognize. Like, if a woman demands space in a relationship or at work...
Like stepping back or curtailing her availability.
Yeah, exactly. If she sets hard limits on her output, the culture immediately validates it. It's coded as self-care, right? Or establishing healthy boundaries, protecting her peace.
Oh, totally. It's heavily praised.
But if a man executes the exact same withdrawal, like demanding space or setting hard limits on his availability, it is immediately pathologized.
Right, it's framed as control.
Yes. Control, emotional unavailability, stonewalling, or even, a form of subtle abuse. The behavior is identical. The words used might even be identical. But the moral verdict of the observer completely inverts.
And to test whether this is merely, an anecdotal feeling or a measurable phenomenon, Riker introduces what he terms the sex swap test.
I love this part. It's his primary diagnostic tool.
Yeah, it's a tool for the reader to expose gamma bias in the wild. The methodology requires you to take any situation, an HR dispute, a viral social media narrative, a campus adjudication, and hold every single empirical fact constant.
So you don't alter the action, the tone, the history, or the evidence at all.
Right. The only variable you change is the sex of the individuals involved. And then you predict the institutional outcome.
It operates exactly like a scientific control variable. You test a chemical reaction, but you only change the temperature to observe the result. If the moral verdict of the institution flips simply because the genders were swapped, Riker argues you have isolated the gamma bias.
Which is a really elegant way to prove it.
It is, but, a skeptic might look at this and say, sure, there are social hypocrisies, but humans are messy. Is this actually a systemic operating system, or just isolated cultural quirks playing out on social media?
Well, Riker anticipates that exact counter-argument. He moves the focus away from cultural anecdotes and directs it squarely at institutional policy. Specifically, he focuses on the legal and educational apparatus.
Right, he goes straight for Title IX.
Exactly. He points to the 2011 Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights Dear Colleague letter. This was a federal directive that fundamentally altered the evidentiary standard in university Title IX proceedings.
It mandated a drop from the clear and convincing standard to a preponderance of the evidence, which mathematically translates to a 50.01% certainty threshold.
Yeah, a margin so razor thin that a coin flip practically clears it.
It's basically just guessing at that point.
Furthermore, the directive strongly discouraged cross-examination. It framed the traditional legal defense mechanism of questioning an accuser as potentially re-traumatizing.
Which strips away basically all due process.
Exactly. In practice, Riker argues, this created a pseudo-judicial environment where a single university investigator, or like a small panel of administrators, could determine a male student's entire academic and professional trajectory based purely on a subjective credibility assessment.
And in this environment, the male's denial inherently counted against him as evidence of lacking accountability.
Right. He uses the Columbia University case of Paul Nungesser to really anchor this point. And the timeline of that case is vital to understanding Riker's argument. Nungesser was accused of assault.
Okay.
He was subjected to the university's Title IX process, a process already operating under this lowered 50.01% threshold. And even under those stacked conditions, he was entirely cleared.
Wow, so they couldn't even meet the 50% mark.
No. The institution found him not responsible. But exoneration did not end the punishment. That is the crux of what Riker identifies as the Kafka trap.
Because Nungesser was procedurally cleared, but his accuser launched a years-long, highly public campaign against him, literally carrying a mattress around the campus.
Right, the mattress performance art.
Yeah. Under normal circumstances, an institution would protect a cleared student from ongoing harassment. Instead, Columbia allowed the social execution to continue on their grounds. And this is the wildest part. They astonishingly credited the accuser's harassment campaign as academic coursework in the visual arts.
It's almost unbelievable. But Riker uses this to demonstrate that the accusation itself has become the sentence. The procedural exoneration was reduced to a footnote.
The institution validated the subjective feeling of the accuser over its own forensic findings. It rewarded the performance of victimhood while entirely discarding the institutional safety of the cleared male student.
And we see the exact same operating system scaled up in the corporate sector. Riker dissects the James Damore Google memo case from 2017 to illustrate corporate gamma bias.
Right, Damore was a software engineer who authored an internal memo critiquing Google's ideological diversity initiatives.
Yeah, and Riker draws specific attention to the linguistic construction of Damore's document. It was not a screed. It utilized careful, hedged statistical language.
He explicitly distinguished between group averages and individual capacity, citing peer-reviewed academic research on personality traits.
Exactly. He was utilizing this standardized, beta-driven language of an engineer attempting to optimize a system. But the institutional response to that data-driven language is what Riker finds so revealing.
Google didn't convene a panel to refute his statistics or debate his methodology, did they?
No, the mechanism of response was immediate termination for perpetuating gender stereotypes. But the justification for that termination is the ultimate proof of Riker's theory.
A female colleague filed a complaint stating that Damore's memo made her feel unsafe.
Yes. Google's HR apparatus treated her subjective, emotional claim of psychological unsafety as actionable forensic evidence. It was sufficient to justify terminating a man who was citing empirical data.
So if you apply Riker's sex swap test to this mechanism, imagine a male engineer filing a formal HR complaint stating that a female colleague's presentation on, say, toxic masculinity made him feel unsafe or harmed.
Riker posits the complaint would be summarily dismissed, and the male employee would likely be directed to counseling to examine his own fragility.
Exactly. But under the rules of gamma bias, female psychological discomfort is elevated to crisis-level data, while male statistical argumentation is pathologized as a form of workplace aggression.
Which traps men in what Riker defines as the double bind. It is a behavioral vice. If you speak up, present evidence, and attempt to lead a discussion, you are deemed aggressive.
Right, you're actively creating a hostile environment.
Yeah. But if you recognize the trap, stay silent and withdraw your participation, your silence is deemed complicity, sullenness, or guilt. If you lead, you dominate. If you yield, you are erased.
I really want you listening to audit your own environment right now. Like, run Riker's sex swap test on your university's code of conduct or the latest sensitivity training at your workplace. Have you witnessed an institutional reaction that would be considered legally actionable or utterly absurd if the genders were reversed?
Because Riker's premise is that once this invisible architecture is illuminated, it becomes literally impossible not to see it operating in every facet of public life.
But diagnosing the architecture is only the first step. The more pressing question is how and why this architecture was constructed in the first place. I mean, it wasn't a spontaneous cultural accident.
No, Riker insists we must examine the historical and economic incentives that built this system, which brings us to his analysis of the state as husband.
Right, so here the text shifts from diagnosing the modern symptoms to excavating the historical foundation. Riker argues that modern bureaucratic institutions systematically captured the role of the traditional family unit.
Yes, he states that over the last several decades, the state effectively positioned itself to replace the father. The mechanism of this replacement was primarily economic.
The state offered itself as a bureaucratic provider, basically buying familial dependency through massive taxation, transfer payments, and the huge expansion of welfare programs.
Exactly. And the cultural narrative marketing this shift was one of liberation, freeing women from financial dependence on individual men. But Riker highlights a massive structural illusion at the center of this narrative.
Yeah, because the emancipated woman of the modern progressive imagination does not actually stand alone. She is standing on the shoulders of a massive, invisible pyramid of male taxpayers she will never meet.
Right, the state did not eliminate the need for male provision. It simply collectivized it through the tax code and removed male authority from the equation entirely.
A traditional husband and father provided for a specific household, and in exchange, he held authority, respect, and a vested intergenerational interest within that unit.
But the modern bureaucratic state extracts resources from millions of men at a distance to fund millions of households, operating entirely without that localized authority.
And a bureaucracy, by its inherent nature, requires the continuous destruction of the self-sufficient family unit to justify its own expansion and budget. Let's look at the mechanics of that incentive structure.
Yeah, it's pretty dark when you break it down.
It is, because if fathers govern and provide for their own households successfully, a massive swath of the administrative state becomes totally obsolete. You no longer need armies of caseworkers, family court enforcement divisions, or expansive Title IV VD funding streams.
Right. Riker specifically targets Title IV VD of the Social Security Act. He explains how it creates a perverse financial incentive for states to maximize child support collections, because the federal government reimburses state governments for a percentage of the administrative costs of running these programs.
So the bureaucracy literally profits from the dissolution of the intact family.
Exactly. The system functionally requires displaced fathers to operate as continuous funding streams while culturally labeling them as disposable liabilities.
And to understand how this economic mechanism gained cultural dominance, Riker synthesizes it with the ideological movements of the 20th century.
Right. While an audience familiar with institutional critique likely knows about Antonio Gramsci and the Frankfurt School, Riker focuses specifically on how Gramsci's concept of the long march through the institutions was weaponized against male biological utility.
Gramsci basically theorized that violent revolution was unnecessary if you could capture a society's cultural imagination. Its universities, its media, its legal academies.
And Riker argues that this institutional capture was seamlessly merged with Marxist grievance economics. Instead of a war between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, the conflict was remapped onto the sexes.
Which is a genius tactical pivot if you're trying to upend society.
It is. This new engine required the canonization of female victimhood to justify institutional intervention, and the normalization of male disposability to keep the engine running.
So they successfully turned male utility, the biological and societal requirement that men work, build infrastructure, and generate taxable revenue, into a voiceless mandate.
While simultaneously turning male authority, which was the traditional reward for that utility, into a punishable offense.
And this historical synthesis brings us to a profoundly dark, honestly pretty jarring, data-driven section of Riker's argument. He titles it The Body Count.
Yeah, he bypasses sociological theory entirely here and looks strictly at the terminal data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, the CDC mortality reports, and in the ass.
The statistical reality presents a massive contradiction to the prevailing cultural narrative. We see extreme disparities in male suicide rates, with men dying by suicide at nearly 4 times the rate of women.
It's staggering. And we see overwhelming majorities in workplace fatalities. Men account for over 90% of all occupational deaths.
Right. They are the ones suffocating in trenches, falling from cell towers, being crushed on deep-sea oil rigs, and dying in logging accidents.
Not to mention the severe, compounding educational decline in boys at every level of academia, and the massive, undeniable disparities in unsheltered street homelessness.
So Riker looks at this terminal data and asks a devastatingly logical question. If men are, as the captured institutions insist, the all-powerful oppressor class hoarding all systemic privilege, why are they dying a decade earlier than the oppressed class?
Right. Why do they make up the vast majority of those sleeping on concrete in the freezing rain?
Exactly. If they design the system for their exclusive benefit, why are they falling off scaffolds in total silence? How does Riker explain the culture's absolute refusal to reconcile these numbers with its ideology?
He argues that the culture has basically been trained to view male suffering as mere scenery. It's just background noise.
Wow. Scenery. That's a brutal way to put it.
It is, but it's accurate. When a man breaks under the pressure, the institutional conversation immediately pivots to his character defects, his failure to adapt, or the inherent toxicity of his masculinity.
But when a woman experiences hardship, the conversation is immediately elevated to a critique of systemic oppression and societal failure requiring legislative intervention.
Exactly. Riker posits that this institutional blindness is a required feature of the system. The societal engine is explicitly designed to extract male labor, male risk, and male blood.
And its primary psychological defense mechanism is to mock or pathologize the very men who are crushed under its weight. Because to look honestly at the male body count would require the institutions to admit that the oppressor class narrative is a mathematically demonstrable lie.
So we have mapped the psychological toll of gamma bias and the economic reality of the state as husband. Naturally, as men wake up to this reality as they experience this family court system, observe the HR double standards and see the reality of the body count, they look for an outlet.
Right, they go online, they find communities, they watch video essays, they share statistics, and they feel a surge of righteous clarity. They genuinely believe they are finally unplugging from the matrix.
But Riker drops a massive analytical bomb on this exact demographic. He calls this digital realization the false awakening. And it is perhaps the most challenging part of his thesis for a lot of guys to hear.
He titles this section, The Dopamine Guillotine. And it serves as a brutal critique of modern internet culture, specifically targeting the very men who believe they have escaped the system.
Because Riker points out a bitter irony. The men who believe they are rebelling against institutional capture by consuming highly concentrated outrage content are, in reality, just feeding a different tentacle of the exact same system.
Yeah, he grounds this critique in neurological data. He cites Dr. Gloria Mark's research on human attention, noting that the average sustained attention span on a single screen has plummeted from 2.5 minutes in 2004 to mere fractions of a minute in recent studies.
It's a degradation of deep thought that Riker argues is entirely intentional. He also points at Gene Twenge's data showing massive spikes in depressive symptoms and suicide risk correlated directly with excessive screen time.
So the digital landscape is not a neutral town square.
No, it is a behavioral modification engine. Social media algorithms do not care about truth or justice. They are designed exclusively to maximize engagement.
And the data proves that anger, envy, and grievance are the most potent drivers of sustained engagement.
Right. The algorithm quickly identifies a man's psychological pain points: his isolation, his frustration with the modern dating market, his justified anger at family court inequities, and it monetizes that pain.
It feeds him a continuous, algorithmically curated loop of content that validates his despair, keeping his cortisol elevated and his dopamine receptors continuously firing in a closed loop.
It is a perfectly engineered trap.
It really is. It's like a guy sitting alone in his apartment, memorizing the statistics of every single player on the field, studying the opposing team's playbook in excruciating detail, screaming at the referee through his television screen, and genuinely believing his anger is impacting the game.
But he never actually laces up his cleats. He never steps onto the grass.
Exactly. Riker is arguing that a man who consumes 400 hours of algorithmic content about institutional bias is not a revolutionary threat to the system. He is a volunteer prisoner.
He is bleeding his time, his generative energy, and his ad revenue data to massive tech conglomerates in Silicon Valley. The institutional apparatus does not fear a man sitting alone in the dark, furious, informed, and typing highly articulate comments into the void.
No, it fears organized men. It fears men who build physical infrastructure.
Right. And Riker incorporates philosopher Nick Bostrom's simulation theory here, but he applies a brilliant, grounded twist to it. Bostrom theorized that humanity might be living inside a highly advanced supercomputer simulation.
But Riker argues that the simulation isn't some sci-fi supercomputer. The simulation is the App Store, and we voluntarily downloaded it.
We have turned identity into a platform business model. Riker calls this the performance cage. We are living in a synthetic, hyper-curated experience designed to harvest our envy and our outrage.
And the supreme tragedy, Riker notes, is that disenfranchised men are performing their awakening and their rebellion on digital platforms that are actively selling their willingness to perform to corporate advertisers.
The rebellion has been commodified.
Completely. Which leaves the reader with a glaring logistical problem. If you cannot fight the system from within captured institutions, and you cannot fight it online because the digital rebellion is a monetized trap, where is the actual battlefield?
Riker's answer is that you remove yourself from the battlefield entirely through a concept he calls radical privacy, or modern asceticism.
He argues that the only viable way to defeat a machine that feeds on your attention, your outrage, and your performance is to simply starve it.
Stop performing your identity for an audience of strangers.
Yeah, the algorithm cannot monetize a man who permanently logs off, deletes the applications, and spends his evenings reading physical books.
It cannot extract data from a man who learns to build a wooden table with his own hands, who trains his physical body in silence, and who keeps his virtues, his accomplishments, and his deepest griefs entirely offline.
In an era of total compulsory exposure, Riker posits that absolute invisibility is the ultimate act of rebellion.
Radical privacy stars the dopamine guillotine, but Riker acknowledges that men cannot live entirely in the woods.
Right? They still have to interact with the physical world, navigate legal contracts, and engage with these captured institutions to some degree.
So before a man can navigate that reality, he must understand the primary weapon being used against him in the physical world. Which brings us to a massive tactical section of the book: the Sophist's Toolkit and the Forge of Logos.
Riker argues that the progressive apparatus maintains control not through physical force, but through language capture. They control the cultural battlefield by actively hollowing out the definitions of foundational words and refilling them with highly subjective emotional charges.
We need to examine the mechanics of how a redefined academic term becomes an enforceable corporate mandate.
Okay, let's break that down.
Take the word safety. Historically, safety meant freedom from physical harm. However, academic departments expanded the definition to encompass freedom from psychological discomfort. This redefined term is then adopted by HR compliance software and corporate sensitivity frameworks. Therefore, if a man presents a statistical argument that contradicts the prevailing ideology, and that argument causes a female colleague's psychological discomfort, she can formally claim she is unsafe.
Which is exactly the mechanism utilized in the James Damore case.
Precisely. The same capture has occurred with the word violence. Violence traditionally meant the unlawful use of physical force. The definition has been expanded by institutional sophists to include speech that causes distress to a designated protected class.
So if words are now legally or corporately categorized as violence, then actual physical violence or severe institutional retribution can be justified as self-defense against that speech.
Exactly. Riker argues this linguistic manipulation is a deliberate tactic designed to terminate inquiry. If your question is labeled violence, the debate is effectively over before you finish your sentence.
So, how does a rational man defend himself against a bureaucratic system that changes the definitions of words mid sentence to ensure his defeat?
Well, Riker offers a conversational defense mechanism based entirely on the Socratic method. Instead of getting angry, instead of apologizing for causing offense, and instead of trying to cite empirical statistics to an entity that views statistics as a tool of oppression.
Which never works anyway.
Right. He instructs men to stay completely calm and relentlessly ask clarifying questions.
Yeah.
Like, what exactly do you mean by that specific term? Or how would you empirically test that claim?
He provides a masterclass on this mechanism through this great barstool anecdote. A man is sitting next to a woman who is passionately reciting popular internet theories, asserting that all male behavior, historically and currently, is rooted in toxic masculinity and a subconscious desire for dominance and control.
Now, the average guy, feeling the sting of that gamma bias, might get defensive. He might raise his voice, try to argue historical nuances, or cite male sacrifices.
But Riker's protagonist does none of that. He remains perfectly calm, refuses to adopt her emotional state, and asks a question rooted purely in the concept of falsifiability.
Right, he asks. If all male behavior is rooted in dominance, what would non-dominant male behavior actually look like?
Can you point to a single human society in recorded history where male protectiveness and physical provision weren't the primary survival strategies for the entire group? Because if your theory explains every single male action as toxic, doesn't it effectively explain nothing? How could your theory be proven false?
The woman's response in the anecdote is entirely predictable. She resorts to ad hominem attacks, labeling him a misogynist.
But Riker emphasizes that the man's goal was not to change her mind. He was conducting a public autopsy on a dead idea.
Exactly. By forcing her to explain the mechanics of her theory, he exposed the ideology without ever raising his voice. He demonstrated to anyone listening that her position was held entirely through social conditioning and group belonging, not through logical deduction.
And he achieved this while keeping his own psychological peace perfectly intact. This conversational tactic is just one application of what Riker calls the forge of logos. It's his methodology for rebuilding the rational man.
To permanently resist this language capture, a man must reclaim the classical tools of thought that the modern educational system deliberately discarded. Riker points back to the trivium grammar, logic, and rhetoric, and heavily references Aristotle's organon.
He explains the mechanics of these tools so well. Grammar is the objective definition of terms. A man must rigorously define his terms before he allows them to be used in an argument.
Right. And logic is the mechanics of non-contradiction. A man must test a premise for internal consistency before he accepts it as true.
And then rhetoric is the application of that logic to persuade or defend. Riker insists that a mind built on this classical foundation simply cannot be gaslit by HR departments or social media sophists.
Which brings us to the crucial, actionable climax of the text. We have diagnosed gamma bias and the state as husband. We have identified the trap of the dopamine guillotine. We've learned to defend against language capture using classical logic.
Now we face the ultimate logistical question. What does a man actually do on Monday morning? How does he practically navigate a career path, a university system, or a legal environment that Riker has exhaustively proven is structurally hostile to his existence?
The psychological hurdle that keeps men paralyzed inside these captured institutions is the sunk cost fallacy. To break this paralysis, Riker applies the John Kelly criterion.
Oh, the mathematical formula.
Yes, it's utilized in probability theory and financial betting to determine optimal investment sizing.
Let's break down the math of that for a second. The Kelly criterion essentially calculates that the expected value of an investment is the probability of winning multiplied by the potential gain minus the probability of losing multiplied by the potential loss. How does Riker apply this math equation to a guy sitting in a toxic HR meeting or a hostile marriage?
He uses it to prove that the only rational basis for continuing any position, whether it is a financial portfolio, a corporate career, or a legal contract like marriage, is its future expected value.
The capital, time, or emotion you have already spent is mathematically irrelevant to the future outcome.
Exactly. If a man has spent 15 years building a career in a corporate environment that now mandates he publicly confess his inherent bias to maintain his employment, the sunk cost fallacy will whisper, "You have invested too much time to walk away now."
But I have to pause and push back on Riker's strategic withdrawal here, because applying a clean mathematical betting formula to a hostile environment sounds incredible in a philosophical vacuum. But practically speaking, how does a man with a 30-year fixed mortgage, 3 dependents, and a highly specialized career path just withdraw his labor?
Right, if he walks away from his corporate job because of a DEI mandate, his family still needs to eat.
The bank still wants the mortgage payment. Does Riker actually provide an economic bridge for this, or is this just ascetic idealism?
It is a vital logistical challenge, and Riker addresses it by defining strategic withdrawal not as a sudden, reckless abandonment of duty, but as calculated triage.
Okay, triage, that makes more sense.
He does not advise a man to quit his job tomorrow and default on his mortgage. Withdrawal is the slow, deliberate redeployment of resources to ground you can actually hold.
It means you stop chasing the corporate promotion that requires ideological compliance. You do the absolute minimum required to secure your paycheck, and you silently redirect your surplus innovative energy, your capital, and your emotional investment into parallel structures.
Like side businesses, hard assets, local community networks, things that the bureaucracy cannot easily reach.
And here we hit another iteration of the double bind. Riker notes that when society observes a woman stepping away from a demanding career or exiting a marriage to find herself, the culture celebrates it. She's setting boundaries.
But when a man executes a strategic withdrawal from a hostile corporate culture, refuses to participate in biased institutions, or quietly steps off the corporate ladder to build his own venture, society frames him as fragile.
He's accused of abandoning his duty, failing to launch, or quiet quitting.
That is gamma bias, attempting to enforce compliance. The exact same act, withdrawing labor and energy, produces opposite moral judgments. But Riker argues that a sovereign man must become entirely indifferent to the crowd's judgment.
A battlefield medic does not waste time and finite medical supplies on a soldier who has sustained terminal wounds. He treats the ones who can survive.
A man withdrawing his surplus labor from a system that openly despises him is performing necessary triage on his own life. You do not try to negotiate with a broken vending machine. You simply stop feeding it your coins.
He grounds this strategy in robust historical precedent, too. He demonstrates that this concept of disenfranchised men retreating, preserving their knowledge, and building parallel structures is a recurring historical cycle.
Riker examines the dissolution of the English monasteries under Henry VIII. When the institutional structures were shattered, the men carrying craft knowledge, agricultural expertise, and literacy did not simply vanish.
They formed independent guilds and localized networks.
He also examines the aftermath of the French Revolution, where the surviving disenfranchised classes built underground networks, Masonic lodges, and private societies to preserve capital and order.
He even looks at the post-Civil War South, where decimated male leadership was forced to form entirely new civic and economic organizations from the rubble of their former institutions.
The mechanism is always the same. When the overarching institution becomes hopelessly hostile, competent men withdraw their energy from the mainstream, preserve their localized knowledge, and build parallel structures of brotherhood and economic competence.
But, and this is the absolute key to the entire thesis, they do not stay hidden in the woods forever. The strategic withdrawal is merely a staging ground. It is the necessary preparation for what Riker calls the prudential return.
True sovereignty in a hostile world is not about becoming a bitter hermit. Prudence is the classical virtue of knowing when to hold ground, when to retreat, and when to advance.
The withdrawal phase allows a man to heal his nervous system from the dopamine guillotine, to achieve financial independence outside of captured corporate structures, to order his own loves, and to govern his household outside the reach of the bureaucratic state.
He builds an unassailable foundation. And once that foundation is secure, he steps back into the world. He engages with society, but he engages on fundamentally different terms.
He is fully alive. He answers only to objective truth and classical logic, and he absolutely refuses to ask a captured institution for permission to exist. He has broken the leverage the machine held over him.
It is a comprehensive blueprint for surviving an era of institutional decay. It demands rigorous intellectual discipline and severe emotional control from the reader.
It is a demanding text, but the clarity it offers is profound. Let's recap the architecture of this deep dive. We started by mapping gamma bias, the invisible rigged scales that flip moral verdicts based on sex, trapping men in double binds.
We explored the economic reality of the state as husband, the bureaucratic incentives that dissolve families, and the ignored body count of male disposability.
We dissected the algorithmic trap of the dopamine guillotine, proving that digital outrage is a commodified false awakening.
And we detailed the actionable path forward, neutralizing language capture with Socratic logic, executing a calculated strategic withdrawal from hostile environments, and preparing for the prudential return as a financially and intellectually sovereign man.
If the underlying mechanics we discussed today clarify the friction you have been experiencing in the modern world, then Riker's text is essential reading.
I completely agree.
I highly encourage you to go to Amazon Kindle or Google Play Books right now and purchase Cyberlad's Retreating from Gamma Bias and Double Binds. If the book delivers the architectural clarity we've outlined, leave a 5-star review. As Riker points out, engaging with the algorithm positively is one of the few ways to force the system to share this kind of unauthorized analysis with other men who are looking for an exit strategy.
And be sure to follow the author at Conrad Riker on Substack to participate in the ongoing intellectual infrastructure he is building.
And again, please like and subscribe to our show to support these deep dives.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over, extrapolating on the economic reality Riker laid out. Riker has provided a highly effective, micro-level strategy for the individual man to withdraw, preserve his capital, and return sovereign. But consider the macroeconomic implications of his thesis.
Which is a terrifying thought for the institutions.
It is. If the state as husband, the massive, sprawling bureaucratic apparatus of modern society, is fundamentally funded by the surplus labor, the tax revenue, and the physical risk of top-tier male producers. What happens if this book acts as a catalyst?
What happens if millions of those highly competent men simultaneously understand the math, read the Kelly criterion, and execute a strategic withdrawal?
If they deliberately downshift their careers, minimize their taxable footprint, refuse to take on corporate leadership roles that require ideological submission, and completely withdraw their surplus economic energy.
That is the ultimate stress test of the system. Does the bureaucratic machine self-correct out of sheer financial necessity, abandoning its ideological mandates because it suddenly runs out of the male capital required to fund itself?
Or does it become vastly more authoritarian, attempting to forcefully extract whatever resources remain from a rapidly shrinking pool of willing producers?
It is a question of systemic survival that the architects of these captured institutions may not be mathematically prepared to answer. They have meticulously designed a game that absolutely requires male participation and male labor to function, while simultaneously rewriting the rules to ensure constant male defeat.
But what happens to the game when the primary players simply refuse to take the field?
A vital question for the years ahead. Until next time, keep diving deep.